The CEO humiliated him in front of 30 executives. "You're only the driver. Know your place." The black man didn't argue. He simply smiled and checked his watch. Because in less than 10 minutes, that same CEO would discover the man he had just insulted was the person who could decide whether he kept his job. Stay until the end, because the identity reveal changes everything, and subscribe for more powerful stories of justice, discrimination, and unexpected reversals. The morning started at the headquarters of Sterling Global, one of the city's most powerful technology companies. Executives were arriving for the company's biggest acquisition meeting of the year. Black sedans lined the entrance. Assistants rushed through the marble lobby. Security guards checked invitations. And behind the wheel of an ordinary company SUV sat Marcus Reed. Marcus was 54, dressed in a clean black driver's uniform, with silver beginning to show in his neatly trimmed beard. He had driven executives for Sterling Global for almost 2 years. Most barely noticed him. That was exactly how Marcus preferred it. He listened, he watched, and he remembered. That morning, CEO Richard Caldwell stormed out of the building and spotted Marcus waiting beside the SUV. "Where have you been?" Marcus checked his watch. "I'm 7 minutes early, sir." Richard's expression hardened. "I don't care. The board is waiting." Marcus opened the rear door. Richard stopped. "You're coming inside." Marcus looked surprised. "Sir? I need someone to carry these documents into the conference room." Marcus reached for the files. Then Richard suddenly pulled them back. "Actually, forget it." He looked Marcus up and down. "You're only the driver." Several executives standing nearby heard him. Richard continued loudly. "Stay with the car. That's what you're paid for." A few people looked uncomfortable. Marcus simply nodded. "Yes, sir." But as Richard walked toward the elevators, Marcus didn't return to the driver's seat. Instead, he pulled a small leather folder from inside his jacket. He opened it. Inside was a document bearing Sterling Global's official seal. Marcus looked toward the conference room, then quietly said, "Let's see how long you keep calling me the driver." Because Richard had no idea that the acquisition meeting wasn't really about buying another company. It was about deciding who would control Sterling Global itself. And Marcus had arrived that morning with the final vote. The CEO thought he had dismissed a nobody. But Marcus wasn't waiting outside because he lacked authority. He was waiting because he wanted to see how Richard treated people when he thought nobody important was watching. Marcus closed the leather folder and returned to the SUV. Inside the conference room, Richard began presenting the acquisition deal to the board. The numbers looked impressive. Revenue projections were climbing. Investors were expected to approve the merger. And Richard was already talking about his future as the company's most powerful executive. Then one board member raised a concern. "There is still one approval missing." Richard frowned. "Whose?" The board secretary looked at her notes. "The controlling shareholders' representative." Richard's smile disappeared. "I was told they wouldn't attend." "They aren't." Richard relaxed. "Then we're fine." The secretary shook her head. "They don't need to attend." She placed a sealed envelope on the table. They already submitted their decision. Richard stared at it. "What's inside?" "Their voting authorization." Richard reached for the envelope. But before he could open it, the conference room doors suddenly opened. Marcus walked in, still wearing his driver's uniform. The room became quiet. Richard's face hardened. "What are you doing in here?" Marcus looked around the room. "Good morning?" Richard stepped toward him. "I told you to wait outside." Marcus nodded. "I remember." "Then leave." Marcus didn't move. Instead, he walked toward the empty chair at the head of the table. Richard laughed. "That's not your seat." Marcus stopped. He looked at the chair, then at Richard. "You're right." He pulled the chair out. "But it is mine." Nobody spoke. The board secretary stood. Her eyes widened. "Mr. Reed?" Marcus nodded. "Yes." Richard looked confused. "You know this man?" The secretary looked directly at him. Everyone on the board has been trying to reach him for weeks. Richard's face changed. Marcus placed the leather folder on the table. The official seal faced upward. I thought we should finally meet. Richard stared at the document. What exactly are you saying? Marcus calmly answered. I own the controlling stake in Sterling Global. Silence. One executive actually dropped his pen. Richard's face turned pale. The man he had just called only the driver wasn't an employee waiting for instructions. He was the majority owner, but Marcus wasn't finished. He opened the folder and placed another document on the table. This is the acquisition review. Richard stared at it. Marcus continued. And I've already read the financial irregularities you didn't mention. The room suddenly felt much smaller, because Marcus hadn't come to punish Richard for insulting him. He had come to determine whether Richard deserved to remain CEO. And now Richard realized something terrifying. Marcus had been watching him for 2 years. Richard's confidence disappeared the moment he realized Marcus had been watching him for 2 years. Not just driving him. Watching. Marcus opened a second folder. Inside were copies of expense reports, executive emails, vendor contracts, and internal complaints. Richard stared at the documents. Where did you get these? Marcus calmly answered. From the company systems. Richard looked toward the board. He's a driver. He shouldn't have access to confidential information. Marcus nodded. That was true when I was hired. He paused. It isn't true anymore. The board secretary looked confused. What changed? Marcus turned toward her. 3 months ago, the board appointed me as the controlling shareholders' independent representative. Richard froze. Nobody had told him. That was intentional. Marcus had requested complete confidentiality while he conducted a review of the company's leadership, and what he found was disturbing. Several executives had approved inflated contracts with companies connected to Richard's friends. A technology supplier had received millions above market value. An executive consulting firm had been paid for work nobody could document. And employee complaints about discriminatory treatment had quietly disappeared. Marcus placed one complaint on the table. This employee reported being denied a promotion after a manager told him clients preferred someone who looked more professional. Richard interrupted. That has nothing to do with me. Marcus looked at him. Then why did your office close the investigation? Richard didn't answer. Another board member picked up the document. Richard, did you authorize this? I don't remember. Marcus opened another file. You signed it. Richard's face tightened. Then he pointed at Marcus. You've been deceiving everyone. Marcus remained calm. No, I've been observing. Richard laughed bitterly. You think sitting behind a steering wheel makes you qualified to run this company? Marcus looked around the table. No. Then he looked directly at Richard. My ownership does. The room went silent again. Richard suddenly understood why Marcus had never argued with him. Why he never complained. Why he always listened. Marcus hadn't been powerless. He had been collecting evidence. Then Marcus pushed one final document across the table. Richard looked down. His name appeared beside a series of unauthorized payments. His expression changed instantly. Where did you get this? Marcus answered quietly. Your own signature put it there. Richard's hands began to shake. But the worst evidence hadn't even been shown. Marcus turned toward the board secretary. Please display the audit. The screen behind them lit up, and the first page revealed something that could destroy Richard's entire career. The first page of the audit appeared on the screen. Nobody spoke. A red highlighted section showed millions of dollars transferred through a chain of companies. Richard stared at it. That report is incomplete. Marcus didn't blink. That's what you told the auditors. Richard looked toward the board. I can explain every transaction. Marcus nodded. Good. He clicked the remote. Another page appeared. Then another. The payments weren't isolated. They formed a pattern. Companies connected to Richard's friends had received inflated contracts. Those companies had then transferred money to consulting firms connected to senior executives. The room became colder with every page. One board member whispered, "How long has this been happening?" Marcus answered, 3 years. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is a setup." Marcus remained completely composed, then explained the signatures. Richard looked at the screen. His own name appeared repeatedly. But there was something even more damaging. Marcus displayed an internal email. Richard had written that certain employees should be kept away from high-visibility positions. The board secretary read it aloud, then looked at Richard. "What did you mean by that?" Richard hesitated. Marcus answered before he could. He meant people who didn't fit the image he wanted the company to present. Several executives lowered their eyes. Marcus revealed that employee complaints had been buried, promotions had been manipulated, and certain black employees had been quietly pushed away from leadership opportunities. Richard tried to defend himself. Those were business decisions. Marcus shook his head. Discrimination doesn't become business strategy because you put it in a spreadsheet. Silence. Then the board chairman stood. "Richard, your authority as CEO is suspended effective immediately." Richard stared at him. "You can't do that." The chairman looked toward Marcus. Marcus gave a small nod. "Yes, we can." Richard suddenly looked toward Marcus. "You planned this." Marcus answered honestly. "I planned an investigation." He closed the folder. "You planned everything else." Security entered the conference room. Richard refused to move. "You think you've won?" Marcus looked at him calmly. This was never about winning. He paused. It was about making sure the people who work here aren't judged by their position, their appearance, or the assumptions someone makes about them. Richard was escorted out. The room remained silent. Then the board secretary asked Marcus the question everyone had been thinking. "Why did you spend 2 years working as a driver?" Marcus smiled. "Because people reveal who they really are when they think you're beneath them." The board members exchanged looks. And then Marcus revealed one final secret. He hadn't originally bought the controlling stake to become CEO. He had bought it after discovering what was happening inside the company. His real goal was to rebuild the culture from the ground up. And the first change would begin with the people Richard had ignored. The room expected Marcus to take the CEO's chair. He didn't. Instead, he stood beside the table and looked at the executives who had remained silent while employees were mistreated. "I don't need his office," Marcus said. "I need accountability." He ordered an independent review of every department, every promotion decision, and every employee complaint that had been buried. Within weeks, the company discovered dozens of cases that had never been properly investigated. Some employees were reinstated. Others received promotions they had previously been denied. The contracts connected to Richard's network were terminated, and every executive involved in the financial scheme was referred to investigators. But Marcus made one decision that surprised everyone. He kept his driver's uniform. One morning, he walked through the lobby wearing the same dark uniform he'd worn for 2 years. A young executive saw him and smiled. "Mr. Reed, are you still driving?" Marcus smiled back. "Sometimes." The executive looked confused. "Why?" Marcus glanced toward the parking garage. "Because there's nothing wrong with honest work." Then he added, "The problem begins when you think someone's job tells you their value." The company eventually held a town hall. Marcus stood on stage in front of hundreds of employees. He told them he had been underestimated because of his race, his appearance, and his position. But he didn't ask anyone to feel sorry for him. He asked them to notice the people around them, the assistant who never gets invited into the meeting, the employee whose ideas are ignored, the person everyone assumes has nothing important to say. He paused. Sometimes the person you overlook is the person who sees everything. The room erupted in applause. Later that afternoon, Marcus walked past the executive garage. Richard's reserved parking space was empty, but Marcus didn't smile. He simply kept walking. Because his victory wasn't humiliating Richard. It was proving that dignity doesn't come from a title. And power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a driver's uniform. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner. Sometimes it listens while everyone else talks. And sometimes the person you dismiss as only the driver is the person who owns the company. Marcus never needed to shout. He never needed revenge. He simply waited until the truth had nowhere left to hide. And when Richard finally learned who was actually in charge, it wasn't Marcus's wealth that shocked him. It was realizing that the man he had treated as invisible had been watching everything. Because respect should never depend on knowing someone's status. If this story reminded you never to judge someone by their job, appearance, or background, subscribe for more powerful stories of justice, hidden identities, and unexpected twists.